Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Willow had always believed that the day she slipped into a white wedding gown would mark the beginning of a life finally at peace, one that would leave behind the shadows of grief, betrayal, and loss. In the final week of July, she stepped into the church with a radiant glow that made it seem as if every wound she had ever suffered had finally healed, as if the love she had found with Drew was strong enough to weather every storm. But life in Port Charles was never so simple. Just moments before the wedding march began to play, Willow came face to face with a truth so cruel it stole the air from her lungs. Drew, the man she was about to marry, and Nina, the mother she had only just begun to forgive, had been carrying on an affair behind her back. There had been no warning signs, no accidental slips, only the cold, blunt reality of betrayal, hitting her squarely in the heart like a merciless blow. What was meant to be a celebration turned, in a breath, into a nightmare. But Willow didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't demand an explanation. She didn't storm down the aisle in a fit of rage or crumble into pieces before the eyes of the gathered guests. Instead, she made a choice, one that was both powerful and quiet. She removed herself. Without a single word, she turned and walked away from it all. No dramatic scene, no confrontation. Just the echo of her heels down the church corridor, the rustle of her dress as she disappeared like a gust of wind. What she left behind was silence, confusion, and the ruins of a day that would never be remembered as a wedding. Her departure marked a turning point, one from which there was no return. Willow was no longer the fragile woman who lived her life trying to meet everyone's expectations. She wasn't going back to the Courtemain mansion, a place that now reeked of hypocrisy. Metro Court was also out of the question. It bore too much of Nina's presence, and every hallway reminded her of the lies that had flourished there. What Willow needed was shelter, somewhere she could breathe freely without the weight of betrayal pressing on her chest. And while rumors buzzed across Port Charles about the failed wedding, somewhere across town, Elizabeth Baldwin quietly opened her home to a woman who needed not just refuge, but restoration. Elizabeth, who had weathered her own share of tragedies, didn't ask questions. She didn't offer pity. She simply extended a room and her trust, knowing instinctively what Willow needed. Without any announcement, Willow began living with Elizabeth and her boys the same day she left the church. No one knew the full story of what had happened with Drew, and no one dared pry. What mattered was that Willow had made a choice, not just to leave physically, but to reclaim herself emotionally. Her presence in Elizabeth's home brought an unexpected calm, a quiet steadiness that soothed even the chaos in Aidan's post-school chatter and Jake's brooding silences. She helped with homework, joined in baking sessions, and occasionally volunteered at the hospital when staff shortages grew severe. These moments didn't erase the pain, but they allowed her to observe it from a safe distance, like viewing a wound through a pane of glass rather than feeling it freshly torn open each day. News of her new living situation spread quickly through Port Charles. Some speculated that she'd been cast out, abandoned by Drew. Others whispered that she had nowhere else to go. But those theories all missed the point. Willow hadn't been discarded. She had walked away. She had shattered the illusion of a perfect marriage before it could bind her to a lie. And in doing so, she had reclaimed a dignity that no engagement ring could have ever offered. There was a strange freedom in that choice. Painful, yes, but liberating in a way she hadn't anticipated. Adding another layer to the story was the cabin once owned by Isaiah Gannon. Many assumed that Willow might retreat there to nurse her wounds in solitude. It was secluded, quiet, even poetic in its distance from town. But it had been damaged in a recent storm and was no longer safe. More importantly, it carried the emotional residue of her illness, her transplant, and the fragile grip on life she'd once clung to. To return there would be to regress into the helplessness she had fought so hard to escape. And being near any place linked to Nina, who had visited the cabin once during her recovery, was out of the question. For someone like Willow, whose heart had been shattered and reassembled more times than she could count, the symbolism of her surroundings mattered. She needed somewhere that didn't just house her body, but safeguarded her spirit. Elizabeth's home, full of lived-in warmth, quiet understanding, and the gentle chaos of family life, became that sanctuary. It wasn't grand, but it was real. It wasn't filled with luxuries, but it brimmed with something more important: authenticity. In that space, Willow was allowed to be nothing more or less than exactly who she was. No expectations, no timelines, no judgments. Her days became slower, quieter. She started journaling again, something she hadn't done since her early days of teaching. She walked to the park alone, sat beneath the oak trees near the hospital, and sometimes visited the chapel in silence, not for prayer, but for space to think. In Elizabeth's home, surrounded by the subtle rhythm of daily life, Willow began the long, difficult process of healing. Not with grand gestures or sudden epiphanies, but through small, deliberate acts of self-care. Every dish she washed, every page she read, every story she listened to from Aidan was a stitch in the new fabric of her identity. And even as Port Charles continued to chatter, speculate, and move on, Willow remained still, anchored, not frozen. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding. She was rebuilding. Quietly. Fiercely. And this time, no one was going to take her voice, her peace, or her future away from her ever again. During this time, Drew vanished from public view. There were no statements, no public appearances, no attempts to offer an explanation or to clear his name. Nina, too, retreated into silence, as if the lack of words could somehow erase the reality of what had happened. It was a tactic that may have worked in the past, waiting out the scandal, allowing public interest to fade, but Port Charles wasn't the kind of town to let betrayal dissolve so easily. Especially not a betrayal so intimate, so raw, and so publicly exposed. The broken wedding wasn't just a personal tragedy, it became a cultural flashpoint. Social media exploded with speculation, with opinions, with hashtags dividing the town and its online onlookers into passionate camps. Some saw Willow as a woman wronged, a symbol of strength for having the courage to walk away from a relationship built on deception. They praised her composure, her dignity, and the way she protected her own worth in the face of devastation. Others, however, criticized her choice to allow the truth to surface so close to the ceremony, accusing her of weaponizing emotion and humiliating Drew and Nina publicly. They argued that if she had known beforehand, as rumors suggested, she should have handled the matter privately. The debate was fierce and unrelenting. Influencers in the soap fan community weighed in. Former hospital staff who had long since left Port Charles even posted cryptic messages that hinted at deeper fractures beneath the surface. But through it all, Willow remained quiet. She didn't post a rebuttal, didn't seek sympathy, and didn't attempt to correct the narrative. Instead, she let the story move on without her, flowing through the algorithm-driven currents of gossip like a ship she had no interest in boarding. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was power. An act of reclamation in a world obsessed with noise. While others speculated, she healed. While they questioned her choices, she focused on rebuilding the parts of herself that had been chipped away by years of emotional compromise. Her priority wasn't defending her dignity online, it was recovering it in real life. Back at Elizabeth's home, a quiet transformation was underway. Elizabeth, ever the perceptive caregiver, noticed the smallest shifts in Willow's demeanor. She could tell when Willow was retreating into herself or when she was finally starting to breathe more freely. The late-night cups of tea, the long walks without words, the tentative laughter shared over dinner, all of it signaled a slow but undeniable return to life. And in her own heart, Elizabeth began preparing for the possibility that Willow might never leave. It was not something either of them had discussed, but the atmosphere in the house had changed. Willow's presence brought something essential, something grounding. The boys no longer tiptoed around awkward silences. Elizabeth no longer felt the vastness of the house in the evenings. There was warmth again, not the kind that blazed like fire, but the kind that seeped slowly into the walls and made everything feel alive. Willow had filled a space that none of them had realized was empty until she was there. Elizabeth told her closest friends that she had never seen a woman like Willow. A weeping willow, she once called her in private, but one that holds up steel in its roots. She hadn't meant it as poetry, she had meant it as truth. Willow, once viewed as delicate, had endured loss, trauma, cancer, betrayal, and emotional abandonment, and somehow emerged more centered than ever. She no longer needed a man to define her or a title to give her value. She had grown into someone who knew her own worth, who had learned that surviving wasn't enough, she had to thrive. Willow's time with Elizabeth had become more than just a pause in her life. It was a reclamation. A rebirth. She began organizing the upstairs bedroom as her own, not just with a suitcase, but with framed photos of Wiley, books she loved, and a plant she tended every morning. She volunteered to take the boys to school. She found peace in the mundane. She and Elizabeth began cooking together, even starting a weekend soup delivery for elderly patients still recovering at home. It was community in its purest form, quiet, simple, and healing. And as she carved out this new life, Willow didn't forget what had happened, but she refused to let it define her. The scandal, the betrayal, the wedding that never was, all of it became a past chapter, closed not with vengeance but with clarity. In a town where secrets and scandals were currency, Willow had chosen something radical: peace. She had walked away from a life of pretense and chosen one rooted in truth, in self-respect, and in quiet strength. And whether she stayed with Elizabeth long-term or eventually found her own place, it was clear that this version of Willow, the one who no longer wept for what was lost, was here to stay. A woman no longer waiting to be rescued. A woman who had rescued herself. So if there is one storyline from the week of July 28 to August 1 that has the capacity to not only shake the foundations of General Hospital's ever-complicated web of relationships but to quietly redefine the emotional tone of the entire series, it is the subtle yet momentous rebirth of Willow. This is not just a transitional arc. It is a deep, psychological reinvention of a woman who has spent years living on the periphery of her own life, often reactive, often accommodating, shaped by the expectations of others. But now, all of that has changed. The Willow that Port Charles thought it knew, the gentle schoolteacher, the devoted mother, the forgiving daughter, the self-sacrificing partner, is no more. In her place stands a woman reassembled not by rage or vengeance, but by radical self-acceptance and a newfound refusal to be broken by the betrayals of others. The power of Willow's transformation lies in its restraint. It's not loud. It's not theatrical. There are no slapdowns in public squares or fiery confrontations in metro court lobbies. Instead, her resurgence happens in the quiet spaces. In the early morning light filtering through Elizabeth's kitchen, in the delicate act of folding sheets and tucking corners with precision, in the unspoken glances exchanged across the dinner table. She is not seeking headlines or validation. She is building something real, something steady, something enduring, and she's doing it without asking for permission. That alone is revolutionary for a character who has so often bent to the weight of expectation. And this quiet revolution doesn't exist in isolation. It has begun to ripple outward, gently but firmly altering the emotional balance of Port Charles. Elizabeth, who first welcomed Willow into her home as an act of compassion, now finds herself witnessing a shift that goes far beyond what she expected. At first, she believed she was offering temporary shelter, a place for Willow to rest and regroup. But it quickly became clear that what was happening inside her home was something more significant, more enduring. Elizabeth didn't just offer Willow a room. She offered her space to breathe. And Willow, in return, brought something essential into the Baldwin household, a presence that soothed the lingering unease left by years of grief and instability. Willow's arrival has stabilized the household in ways Elizabeth hadn't anticipated. Her interactions with the boys are natural and nurturing, not forced or hesitant. She doesn't overstep, she doesn't intrude. She simply integrates, and in doing so, provides a new rhythm, a calm, intentional cadence to daily life. Aidan has taken to baking again, often requesting Willow's input on new cookie recipes. Jake has started opening up more during dinners, drawn out by Willow's patient, non-judgmental presence. Even Elizabeth, who had been so used to carrying everything on her own, now finds herself exhaling in Willow's company. There are nights when they sit on the porch in silence, sipping tea, watching the moon rise without needing to speak. It's in those quiet hours that the magnitude of Willow's transformation becomes most visible. Outside the home, Port Charles is slowly adjusting to this new version of Willow. At the hospital, colleagues notice the way she moves through the corridors. Not timid, not rushed, but with clarity and direction. She volunteers for shifts when there are shortages, mentors younger nurses, and even sits with terminal patients who have no visitors. These aren't the acts of someone trying to stay busy to distract herself. These are deliberate choices, grounded in empathy but no longer rooted in a need for approval. There's a steadiness to her now, an emotional discipline that radiates strength. The same strength that allowed her to walk away from the altar without anger, without spectacle, but with complete control over her own narrative. Meanwhile, the town's social narrative continues to swirl. While Drew and Nina remain conspicuously absent from public life, whispers grow louder. Speculation runs rampant, dissecting every detail of the broken wedding. Online forums churn out theories, gossip columns try to track Nina's movements, and even casual diners at Kelly's trade opinions like currency. But despite the noise, Willow remains unmoved. Her silence has become a kind of armor, a shield that deflects the drama while she focuses on healing and growth. There's power in that silence, not the silence of submission, but of sovereignty. She doesn't owe the town a performance. She's done performing. It is this choice, not to retaliate, not to explain, that has reframed her place in the Port Charles universe. She is no longer a supporting character in the lives of others. She is her own axis now, and others are beginning to orient around her. Elizabeth feels it. Wiley feels it. Even those who once dismissed her as fragile now regard her with a wary respect. Because once someone has reclaimed themselves fully, they become unpredictable, and that unpredictability is power. Port Charles, a town used to fireworks and breakdowns, doesn't quite know what to do with someone who refuses to crumble. And that makes Willow more formidable than ever. There's even speculation among fans and in-universe characters alike that Willow's current arc could have long-term implications far beyond her personal recovery. Some believe she might take on a more permanent role at the hospital, perhaps stepping into a leadership position that reflects the calm authority she now exudes. Others whisper that she might become a key player in town politics or non-profit leadership, especially if her emotional clarity continues to draw others into her orbit. But even if she makes no grand moves, her presence alone has already begun reshaping the emotional weather of Port Charles. So if Elizabeth now has a guest in her home, it is not merely someone licking her wounds. It is someone evolving into a central force. A quiet architect of emotional realignment in a town often shaken by chaos but rarely changed by it. Willow is not loud, but she is undeniable. Not flashy, but unforgettable. And her journey, from broken bride to serene storm, may very well be one of the most consequential evolutions Port Charles has witnessed in recent years. As the town continues to swirl with betrayal, power plays, and dramatic reveals, there is something revolutionary about a woman who chooses stillness, chooses healing, chooses herself. And that is precisely why Willow's story matters, not just for what it says about her, but for what it promises to those watching, that sometimes, the most profound power comes not from vengeance or victory, but from peace, earned the hard way. In the end, what began as a shattered wedding day has blossomed into one of the most profound character transformations Port Charles has seen in years. Willow, once underestimated as fragile, compliant, and emotionally porous, has undergone a metamorphosis not forged in spectacle but in silence, not through destruction but through deliberate, internal reconstruction. Her withdrawal from Drew and Nina's betrayal was not a retreat but a reclamation. An act of profound self-preservation that sent ripples through every household, every institution, and every emotional stronghold in town. She did not cry out for justice, nor did she demand apologies. Instead, she walked away with dignity, stepping into the unknown on her own terms, and in doing so, redefined the nature of power in Port Charles. For so long, Willow had lived as a secondary figure in the lives of others. A daughter in search of acceptance, a partner willing to bend, a mother constantly guarding her child from the sins of the adults around him. But now, that version of her has been laid to rest. In its place stands a woman who has learned to define her own narrative without seeking permission. The weeks that followed the broken wedding have not been filled with revenge plots or public outbursts, but with an internal discipline that is far more threatening to the town's status quo. She has become a mirror, quietly reflecting back to others their own inconsistencies, their own emotional cowardice, simply by refusing to engage in the same cycles of dysfunction that once consumed her. Her presence in Elizabeth's home has transformed from that of a temporary guest into a vital, grounding force. What was meant to be a short respite has evolved into a new way of life, not just for Willow, but for the entire Baldwin household. The boys have grown calmer in her presence, Elizabeth herself has found unexpected companionship, and the once transient space has become a symbol of healing. Willow's daily rituals, the way she folds laundry with care, waters the plants at dawn, walks barefoot through the hallway to check on the children at night, have become a kind of emotional architecture for the house.